The first snow of December 1944 fell quietly over the Ardennes forest, its soft white blanket masking the storm that was about to explode beneath it. The soldiers of the Allied Front, American, British, and a handful of Belgian units found the snow almost comforting. It muffled the sounds of distant artillery and made the dense forests seem less menacing. The men thought the war was nearing its end. The German army was broken, retreating eastward through shattered cities and ruined villages. Hitler, they believed, could no longer fight, and Berlin would soon fall. Many divisions were preparing for Christmas. Officers allowed decorations in foxholes and field huts. Carols were sung over weak radio signals. The front in the Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place for rest and rotation, not battle. But beneath that deceptive calm, in the forests opposite them, the German Wehrmacht was awakening for one last strike, a desperate, audacious gamble that would become the largest and bloodiest battle the army would ever fight. The Allies did not know it, but the silence in the woods was not peace. It was the intake of breath before the storm. In the west of Germany, Adolf Hitler had retreated into a world of maps and fantasies. The Third Reich was collapsing, but he refused to believe it. Allied bombers pounded the cities daily, Soviet armies clawed through the ruins of the East, yet Hitler still dreamed of turning defeat into miracle. He had seen his generals falter and his empire crumble, but he had also seen surprise change the course of battle before at Ardennes in 1940 when his tanks had burst through France's supposedly impenetrable defenses and brought Europe to its knees. Now, in the winter of 1944, he sought to recreate that miracle in reverse. In September, even as his armies reeled from Normandy and the Falaise pocket, Hitler conceived a plan he called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It would strike through the Ardennes once again, this time westward, in a bold thrust toward Antwerp. The plan was madness to most of his generals. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength or fuel to mount such an offensive, but Hitler's reasoning was as psychological as it was strategic. He knew the Western Allies were tired, confident, and politically fragile. If he could split the American and British armies, seize Antwerp, and surround a portion of the Allied front, perhaps the Western powers would sue for peace, leaving him to concentrate on the Soviets. It was an illusion, but it was all he had left. For the plan to succeed, secrecy was paramount. Every trace of preparation had to be hidden. The German High Command assembled under strictest silence. Orders were transmitted verbally, never written. Units were moved only at night, disguised as defensive redeployments. Deception units broadcast false radio traffic, suggesting preparations for defensive operations in the north. Even the troops themselves were not told the true nature of their mission until the last possible moment. To the world, it appeared Germany was on the defensive. In reality, Hitler was gathering nearly 300,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces in the forests of Eifel and Hürtgen. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence so formidable since D-Day was asleep. The victory in France had bred complacency. Their radar networks, air superiority, and decrypted Enigma communications had convinced them the Germans could no longer move undetected. The ultra-intercepts from Bletchley Park, which had guided Allied commanders for years, suddenly went quiet, not because the Germans had stopped talking, but because they were no longer using the compromised channels. German communications became disciplined and sparse. The result was a fatal illusion. Silence was mistaken for weakness. Intelligence officers in Chaff's Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, began receiving scattered reports, prisoners mentioning new panzer formations, aerial reconnaissance noting fuel dumps hidden in the woods, resistance sources whispering about a possible counterattack. But these were dismissed as fragments, not patterns. The G2 branch under General Kenneth Strong believed any German offensive would be local and limited, perhaps a spoiling attack to delay the inevitable Allied advance. Field commanders in the Ardennes, such as Major General Troy Middleton of the 8th Corps, were told to expect little more than increased local activity. Even the weather conspired with Hitler. December brought heavy fogs, snowstorms, and low clouds that grounded the Allied air forces their greatest advantage. The Germans knew it and timed their attack precisely for this window of darkness. American divisions in the Ardennes, such as the 99th, 106th, and the battered remnants of the 28th, were thinly spread across a front too wide to hold. Most units were inexperienced replacements, their commanders lulled by weeks of calm. The veterans called it the Ghost Front. It was quiet, too quiet. In his memoirs, General Omar Bradley would later write, "We had discounted the enemy's strength and overestimated our own. It was a blindness born of victory. The warning signs were all there, yet disbelief blinded the command structure from Eisenhower down to the platoon level. When a captured German soldier revealed that an attack was imminent, U.S. intelligence dismissed him as delusional. When Belgian civilians reported the sounds of armor moving at night, they were told it was probably American convoys. The line held no deep defenses, no fortified fallback positions. It was a thin screen over a mountain of arrogance. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the forest exploded from Monschau to Echternach. A thunderous roar shook the snow from the trees. 18 German divisions, supported by over 500 artillery guns, opened fire in unison. The morning sky lit up like 1,000 storms. Shells rained down on American positions, tearing apart wire lines and command posts. The shock was total. Units that had been laughing around campfires minutes earlier found themselves under a storm of fire that seemed endless. It was as if the entire horizon had opened up. One survivor from the 106th Division recalled, "We couldn't see the enemy, just flashes, everywhere." Then came the tanks, Panthers and Tigers, painted white for camouflage, rolled through the smoke like phantoms. German infantry followed close behind, shouting and firing as they advanced through the shattered snowfields. The Americans were bewildered, unprepared, and cut off from communication. Some units fought valiantly, others simply dissolved. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in green, was encircled within 2 days. Over 7,000 men captured in one of the largest surrenders of American troops in Europe. Roads became clogged with retreating convoys and refugees. Bridges were blown too late. The German spearheads pierced deep into Belgium, threatening to split the Allied front in two. At headquarters in Luxembourg, confusion reigned. Reports were contradictory, telephones dead, and commanders struggled to comprehend the scale of what was unfolding. Eisenhower initially believed it was a diversionary attack. Bradley thought it was a local thrust. Only after 24 hours did the realization dawn this was a major offensive, a nightmare reborn from the ashes of 1940. And by then, Hitler's gamble had already achieved its first success, strategic surprise. The forest that had seemed peaceful days before was now a furnace of fire and steel. Snow turned black with soot and blood. Towns like St. Vith, Malmedy, and Bastogne became names etched into history, and for the men on the ground, the question of intelligence failure meant nothing. They fought only to survive. But for the generals, for the Allied command that had prided itself on omniscience, the Ardennes was a humiliation that would haunt military intelligence for decades. The thunder of German artillery had barely ceased when the full horror of the situation began to sink in. Allied headquarters, first Bradley's 12th Army Group, then Eisenhower's SHAEF, was overwhelmed by conflicting reports. Field telephones buzzed with panic divisions disappearing from the map, regiments surrounded, and supply lines collapsing under the sudden flood of enemy armor. It seemed impossible. How could the Germans, supposedly broken and retreating, have assembled such force without detection? How had they crossed rivers, marshaled tanks, and positioned entire panzer armies within striking distance all under the Allies' noses? The answer, historians later concluded, was a perfect storm of arrogance, deception, and weather. But in those first days, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the Western Front, once believed stable, was now a bleeding wound stretching from Luxembourg to Liège. At the center of Hitler's offensive were three spearheads. In the north, under Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, the elite Waffen-SS units spearheaded the assault. Leibstandarte, Hitlerjugend, das Reich battle-hardened and merciless. Their mission seized the Meuse River and capture Antwerp. In the center, General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army struck toward Bastogne and Saint-Ovyet, the key road junctions of the Ardennes. To the south, General Brandenberger's 7th Army protected the flank, and advanced toward Luxembourg. Each formation was to drive forward relentlessly, converging westward like claws closing on their prey. The plan was brilliant in conception, insane in ambition, but in those early days, it worked. On the morning of December 17th, thick fog still hung low over the frozen fields. The air was sharp and quiet except for the distant rumble of tanks. Along the Elsenborn Ridge, men of the 99th Infantry Division, mostly young Americans barely out of training, found themselves facing the armored vanguard of Kampfgruppe Piper, an SS formation named after its commander, Joachim Piper. He was only 29 but already infamous for his ruthlessness, a protege of Himmler himself. His column of tanks and half-tracks, led by Tiger IIs, crushed through American positions with terrifying efficiency. Those who resisted were annihilated. Those who surrendered faced worse. Near the crossroads town of Bonneau, Piper's men gathered more than 80 captured American soldiers and executed them in the snow, a massacre that would later be known as Malmedy. News of it spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. It hardened the resolve of American troops everywhere. Surrender was no longer an option. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and the 101st Airborne were ordered to hold the town at all costs. Bastogne was more than just another Belgian village. It was the hub of 7 key roads. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of armies across the Ardennes. By December 20th, the 101st was completely encircled. German artillery rained shells day and night, while the paratroopers dug into frozen foxholes. Short on ammunition and food, the weather remained merciless, clouds thick, snow relentless, visibility near zero. The skies that had once belonged to the Allies were now their prison. Planes could not fly, and supply drops were impossible. Yet the men held firm. At SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower faced his greatest crisis since Normandy. The offensive had torn a 50-mile gap through the center of his line. Bradley's armies were reeling. Montgomery's forces in the north were caught off guard. For a moment, there was talk of retreating to the Meuse, but Ike's calmness steadied the room. The present situation is to be regarded as an opportunity for us and not a disaster, he told his commanders. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. It was the kind of optimism that disguised how thin the line had become. The Allies would have to respond quickly or risk losing the initiative of the entire Western campaign. But to respond, they first had to understand how they had been blindsided. The Allied intelligence apparatus in late 1944 was vast but fragmented. At the top were the ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, providing invaluable insight into German communications. But by December, those intercepts had gone dark. Hitler had restricted radio transmissions, and most orders were now hand-delivered by couriers. Aerial reconnaissance was similarly crippled. Low clouds and snow rendered the skies useless. What few photographs were taken showed nothing but endless white forest. And the human intelligence network, the resistance cells, double agents, and informants that had served so well in France was now thin and unreliable in Germany's own borderlands. Some analysts had seen the pattern emerging. Colonel Oscar Koch, intelligence chief for Patton's Third Army, warned his superior of a possible major German counterattack in the Ardennes. Patton, a man who trusted instinct as much as maps, took the warning seriously. "Let's keep our tanks warm," he said cryptically, but higher command dismissed Koch's reports. So did British intelligence. The notion that the Germans, starved of fuel, short of men, and crushed on both fronts, could mount a large-scale offensive seemed ludicrous. It was not intelligence failure in the sense of missing data. It was failure of imagination. By December 19th, that failure was costing thousands of lives. The Germans advanced faster than even Hitler expected. Their armored columns snaked along narrow forest roads, engines growling under snow-laden pines. Villages were flattened, civilians fled or hid in cellars. American units were scattered and often fought in isolation, cut off, surrounded, improvising desperate defenses. Some fell back and regrouped, others fought to the last man. In St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division held out for 5 crucial days, delaying the German timetable and preventing the offensive from reaching its full potential. That delay, historians would later agree, may have saved the Allied line, On December 20th, Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to a stormy conference in Verdun. Patton arrived last, stomping snow from his boots, his polished helmet reflecting the lamplight. Ike asked how soon he could pivot his army north to relieve Bastogne. 2 days, Patton said without hesitation. The room erupted in disbelief. His entire army was facing east toward Germany, and now he was proposing a 90-degree turn in 48 hours. But Patton had anticipated this moment. His staff had already drawn contingency plans for exactly such an event. "We can attack on the 22nd, he assured. Eisenhower nodded. "Then do it." Meanwhile, in Bastogne, McAuliffe received a German demand for surrender. His reply would become legend. Nuts, the single word, translated loosely by his staff as "go to hell," embodied the American spirit of defiance in those frozen days. The 101st held their perimeter through wave after wave of assault, fighting not only Germans but frostbite and starvation and exhaustion. They fought for every building, every field, every tree. The surprise had been total. The price catastrophic, but the tide was beginning to shift. German columns were slowing, their fuel was running out, their supply lines overextended, and on December 23rd, the skies cleared, high above the snow. The drone of engines returned, the Allied air forces were back. The morning of December 23rd broke with a brilliance that soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. For the first time in a week, the skies above the Ardennes were clear, the snow glistened under a sharp winter sun, and the fog that had cloaked the German advance lifted to reveal the full extent of the battlefield. Burning tanks, shattered convoys, and endless lines of frozen corpses half buried in white drifts. For the Allies, it was as if a divine hand had pulled away a curtain. For the Germans, it was disaster. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. With fuel reserves dwindling and pilots scarce, it could do little to contest the skies. Within hours, Allied air power returned in force. Thousands of fighters and bombers roared overhead, thunderbolts, Mustangs, typhoons striking columns, bridges, and fuel depots with merciless precision. The frozen roads that had carried Hitler's panzers westward now became killing grounds. They were sitting ducks, one pilot recalled. "We just followed the tracks in the snow and fired until the tanks stopped moving." For the first time since the offensive began, the momentum shifted. The Allies could see again, think again, fight back at Bastogne. The 101st Airborne looked to the skies and cheered as C-47 transport planes appeared, dropping supplies by parachute ammunition, food, medicine, and the one thing they needed most, hope. Many of the men wept openly. It was like watching angels, said a paratrooper from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. "We thought we were done for. Then those planes came. The siege continued, but the defenders no longer felt abandoned." The relief promised by Patton was on its way. Meanwhile, in Hitler's headquarters at the Adlerhorst compound, the mood was turning grim. The Führer, who had demanded nothing less than the capture of Antwerp, refused to believe his offensive was faltering. His generals, including Rundstedt and Manteuffel, pleaded for flexibility, withdrawal, reorganization, perhaps even a controlled retreat. Hitler exploded in rage. "The enemy will collapse," he shouted. "They are weak, decadent, divided. One more push, and we shall reach the Meuse." His obsession blinded him to reality. The fuel crisis was crippling his armored divisions. Captured American depots could not sustain the advance. Entire panzer brigades were immobilized, their engines cold, their crews scavenging for gasoline among the wrecks. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, which had cut so deeply into the American lines, was now stranded. His tanks, once roaring with fire, stood silent in the snow, surrounded and hunted. Peiper ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and fight their way east on foot through the forest. They left behind a trail of burned-out armor, symbols of both the daring and futility of Hitler's last gamble. But the battle was far from over. The German army, though trapped, still fought with ferocity. At St. Vith, the delaying action turned into a desperate stand. American forces, aided by British armored units under Montgomery in the north, began counterattacks along the flanks of the German salient. The shape of the front line now resembled a bulge pushing westward, hence the name history would give the battle. And within that bulge lay tens of thousands of soldiers freezing, starving, and dying in a landscape of smoke and ice. The Allied command, now fully awake to the danger, coordinated its countermeasures with precision. Bradley reinforced Patton's Third Army from the south, while Montgomery strengthened the northern shoulder near Malmedy and Houffalize. The goal was to squeeze the bulge from both sides, trapping the German forces inside. But even as the Allies regained control, the full story of how the attack had come as such a shock began to emerge. The failure of Allied intelligence in December 1944 remains one of the most studied and haunting in modern military history. It was not a failure of data, but of interpretation. Reports had existed, intercepted messages hinting at a buildup, resistance contacts describing armored movements, even Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft observed over the Ardennes. But analysts, conditioned by months of German retreat, interpreted every sign through a lens of optimism. They believed the Germans incapable of strategic initiative. "We were looking for what we expected," wrote one intelligence officer later, "not what was really there." General Eisenhower himself admitted as much after the war. "The intelligence failure was my own." He said, "I believed what I wanted to believe, that the enemy could no longer organize a major offensive. I was wrong. The complacency of success had dulled the edge of vigilance. The same Allied intelligence machine that had cracked Enigma and orchestrated D-Day had fallen victim to psychological blindness." Yet even Hitler's surprise could not overcome the strategic imbalance of 1944. The Wehrmacht no longer possessed the industrial base or manpower to sustain an offensive. Every mile gained cost irreplaceable tanks, fuel, and veterans. The German High Command had staked everything on a single roll of the dice, and now, as Allied forces rallied, that gamble was collapsing into catastrophe. In the frozen fields around Bastogne, the paratroopers endured endless bombardment. Each day brought new assaults, infantry waves, tanks pushing through the snow, artillery screaming overhead, houses collapsed, trees splintered, foxholes filled with blood and ice. Yet McAuliffe's men held. They fought from cellar to cellar, from wall to wall, their rifles crusted with frost. When the Germans tried to break through on Christmas Eve, they were met with machine gun fire and bazookas at point-blank range. The defenders' radio message that night was simple, still holding. Christmas Day dawned gray and bitterly cold. For many soldiers, it was the bleakest Christmas they would ever know. Across the Ardennes, men huddled in trenches, writing letters home they would never send. "The snow is red," one wrote, "and it keeps falling." In Bastogne, however, the sound of distant engines grew louder, the unmistakable thunder of Patton's tanks. By the afternoon of December 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to the besieged town. The men of the 101st cheered, though most were too weak to stand. Relief had come, but victory was still far away. The German offensive had reached its high watermark. From this moment onward, the bulge would begin to shrink. As the year ended, the Allied counteroffensive gathered momentum. The weather remained frigid, but the skies stayed clear, allowing continuous airstrikes that decimated retreating German columns. The once proud panzer divisions fell back toward the Rhine, leaving wreckage behind, burned vehicles, shattered guns, dead horses, and the frozen bodies of men who had believed in a miracle that never came. Villages like L'Église, Foy, and Houffalize were reduced to rubble. Civilians emerged from cellars to find their world obliterated. "The Ardennes was hell," said one Belgian survivor. "The snow hid the bodies, but not the smell." By January 1945, Hitler's dream of splitting the Western Allies lay in ruins. His army had lost over 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and irreplaceable fuel reserves. The Allies, though battered, had recovered and closed the bulge. The German army would never again mount a major offensive on the Western Front. And yet, even in defeat, Hitler's December gamble had achieved one thing: it had forced the Allies to confront their own fallibility. The Battle of the Bulge was not only a test of arms, but a test of judgment, a reminder that even victory can breed blindness. So, as January 1945 dawned, the Ardennes lay frozen and desolate. The forests that had once concealed Hitler's bold gamble were now fields of ruin-blackened trees standing like skeletal sentinels over snowdrifts filled with shattered machines. and the unburied dead. Smoke still rose from villages reduced to rubble. For miles, one could hear nothing but the moan of the winter wind and the distant rumble of artillery as the Allies pushed to erase the Bulge that had nearly torn their line apart. By the first week of January, the German advance had ground to a halt. What had begun as a daring strike toward Antwerp had devolved into a desperate retreat toward the Rhine. Hitler, still deluded by visions of victory, refused to authorize withdrawal until it was too late. The offensive will be renewed, he insisted, pounding the map before him. But his generals knew the truth. There was no fuel, no reserves, and no time. The panzers were stranded in snow and mud, their engines silent. The Ardennes, once chosen for secrecy, had become a trap. The Allied counterattack began in earnest on January 3rd. From the north, British and American forces under Field Marshal Montgomery struck southward. From the south, Patton's Third Army pushed north, tightening the jaws of the trap. Between them lay the battered remnants of Montefel's and Dietrich's armies, their once proud divisions now shadows of their former selves. The weather, which had once favored the Germans, now turned against them. Allied air power roamed the skies unchallenged, striking convoys, bridges, and any vehicle daring to move by day. What the Americans called thunderbolt weather spelled doom for the Wehrmacht. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a nightmare without end. You couldn't tell where the front was anymore. One GI recalled, every hill looked the same. Burned tanks, frozen bodies, snow stained black and red. Entire platoons were wiped out by artillery or frostbite. Medics worked with bare hands, unable to keep their tools from freezing. In some units, more men were lost to exposure than to enemy fire. Yet still, they fought inch by inch through the woods and over the icy hills, determined to drive the enemy back to Germany. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne, finally relieved but refusing to rest, now joined the pursuit. The town that had been their prison was now their fortress. They pushed outward, clearing villages one by one. "We were tired beyond words," said a paratrooper from Easy Company, "but after what they did to us, we weren't stopping until we pushed them all the way back." The Germans, outnumbered and running low on supplies, began to crumble. Prisoners streamed in by the hundreds, young boys and old men in ill-fitting uniforms, frostbitten and hollow-eyed. Among them were veterans who had fought in France, Russia, and Italy, now reduced to scavenging frozen bread from abandoned farms. By mid-January, the great salient, once 50 miles deep, was shrinking rapidly. Towns like Houffalize and St. Vith, once symbols of German momentum, were now ruins contested at terrible cost. We fought for every ruined house, remembered an American lieutenant. They'd fire from the basements, from the cellars. You couldn't tell if a wall had Germans behind it until it shot back. At Schaeff headquarters, the generals tracked the shifting front on maps crowded with colored pins. Eisenhower, whose calm had steadied the Allies during the crisis, was now methodical and cold. "We must make them pay for every foot of ground," he said. Bradley's 12th Army Group and Montgomery's 21st coordinated their pincer movements with increasing precision. What had begun as chaos was now turning into calculated retribution, but amid the planning and the triumph, the bitter question still haunted the command tents and staff rooms. How had this happened? The postmortems began even before the battle ended. Intelligence officers pored over reports, captured documents, and interrogations of German prisoners. The picture that emerged was damning. Weeks before the offensive, Allied aerial reconnaissance had photographed hundreds of trains moving toward the Eifel region, but analysts had dismissed them as logistical withdrawals. Civilian reports from Belgium and Luxembourg had warned of troop movements, but local commanders considered them rumor. Even Ultra, so reliable since 1940, had failed to provide warning, not because it was broken, but because the Germans had learned to shut up. As one British officer bitterly remarked, "The enemy fooled us simply by keeping his mouth closed." It was a painful irony. The Allies had become victims of their own success. For months, their technological superiority had given them a false sense of omniscience. They had come to believe that nothing in Europe could move without being seen or heard. Yet in the dark forests of the Ardennes, Hitler had proven that the oldest weapon in war, surprise, still had the power to humble empires. As Patton's tanks rolled through the snow, Eisenhower ordered that lessons be learned and remembered never again. He told his staff, "Will we assume the enemy's finished until he's on his knees?" The failure at the Ardennes would shape Allied intelligence doctrine for decades. It would become a case study in military academies, the danger of ignoring inconvenient evidence, the peril of wishful thinking, and the cost of underestimating an opponent. Meanwhile, inside Germany, the effects of the failed offensive were catastrophic. The losses in men and material could not be replaced. Hitler's gamble had drained the last reserves of his war machine. The fuel burned in the Ardennes would never be recovered. The tanks lost, there would never be rebuilt. The Reich's Western Front, once fortified by hope, now lay open to invasion. In February, the Allies would cross the Rhine. In April, they would meet the Red Army on the Elbe. The Battle of the Bulge, intended to save Germany, had instead accelerated its destruction. And yet, among the men who fought there on both sides, the battle left a legacy far beyond maps and statistics. It was a test of endurance, faith, and survival. "I saw what men could do," wrote a U.S. private in his journal, "not just to kill, but to hold on when holding on seemed impossible." German veterans, too, spoke of the Ardennes with a mixture of pride and sorrow, a last spark of the old discipline and courage, squandered in a futile cause. By the end of January, the snow began to melt. Streams of water ran through shell holes and over the wrecks of tanks, washing away the soot, but not the memory. The Ardennes, quiet again, became a cemetery. Soldiers returning weeks later found helmets half buried in thawing ground, rifles jutting from the ice like crosses. It was said that when the spring birds returned, they sang over 20,000 unburied bodies. For the Allies, victory in the Bulge was costly beyond measure, nearly 90,000 casualties, the highest of the war in Europe. For the Germans, it was fatal, over 100,000 men lost, along with the illusion that the Reich could still decide its fate. And for the world, it was a brutal reminder that even on the brink of victory, vigilance must never sleep. In later years, historians would debate endlessly, was the failure of Allied intelligence inevitable? Could ultra or reconnaissance have done more? Could Eisenhower or Bradley have foreseen it? The answers vary, but one truth stands above the rest: war punishes complacency. In December 1944, the Allies believed they understood their enemy. The Battle of the Bulge proved otherwise. The snow of the Ardennes melted, but its lesson endured. The snowmelt of February 1945 revealed the full ruin of Hitler's last gamble. What the soldiers had called the Bulge was now a scar upon Europe, a grotesque wound stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg. The forests were stripped bare, the villages burned to stone foundations, and the roads were littered with the wreckage of two armies. In places like Stavelot, Houffalize, and Bastogne, corpses still surfaced as the ice receded. Americans, Germans, civilians, all frozen where they had fallen. Crows fed on what remained, and the local peasants buried the dead in long trenches when the thaw came. The war was moving east now, but in the Ardennes, time seemed to have stopped. For Hitler, the failure of the offensive marked the final shattering of his illusions. His headquarters at the Adlerhorst was no longer the center of decision, it was a tomb of denial. Reports from the front were grim. The 6th Panzer Army had been mauled, the 5th Panzer Army destroyed, the 7th reduced to a remnant. Over 600 tanks lay wrecked or abandoned. Whole regiments had ceased to exist. The miracle Hitler had promised his people had turned to dust, yet he refused to face reality. It was betrayal. He ranted, accusing his generals of cowardice. If only they had fought as they did in 1940. But even those loyal to him like Model and Rundstedt knew the truth. The Ardennes offensive had drained the last life from the Wehrmacht. At Allied headquarters, the tone was both triumphant and weary. The crisis had passed, the line restored, and the German army's strength broken for good. But the price had been staggering. Eisenhower wrote to Washington that the battle had been won, but at a cost so heavy that it will be felt for years. The casualty list filled pages, thousands of dead, wounded, or missing. The snow that had hidden their suffering was gone now, and what it revealed was the true face of war. Young men lying in shallow graves, their faces untouched by age, but marked forever by fear. For the intelligence officers who had failed to predict the onslaught, the reckoning was severe. In post-action analyses conducted through February and March, both American and British intelligence branches dissected every warning missed, every report dismissed. General Kenneth Strong, SHAEF's intelligence chief, admitted bluntly, "The fault was not in our tools, but in our thinking. Ultra had not failed them, they had failed Ultra. The Germans had adapted their communications using couriers and landlines to evade interception. The Allies, meanwhile, had grown dependent on signals intelligence, neglecting human sources. We had machines listening to the enemy," Strong later reflected, "but we had stopped listening to ourselves. The problem was deeper than information, it was psychology. After Normandy and Paris, after the sweep through France, the Allies had come to believe that victory was inevitable. Reports that contradicted that belief were quietly ignored or rationalized. When Belgian resistance groups warned of a buildup in the Eifel, they were told the Germans were merely shifting troops to defend the Siegfried Line. When aerial photos showed armored columns hidden under forest canopies, analysts called them phantom divisions. In short, the Allies did not fail to see, they failed to believe what they saw. It was a blindness born of triumph. Patton, who had predicted the attack with eerie foresight, expressed little sympathy for his colleagues. They were caught with their pants down. He told his staff bluntly, "Never think the enemy's finished until he's buried." His own Third Army, which had wheeled north in a blizzard to relieve Bastogne, became the symbol of Allied recovery. In one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the war, Patton's men pivoted 90 degrees in 2 days, something thought impossible in winter conditions, and struck at the German southern flank, shattering the siege. Patton's aide later wrote, "It was the moment when the tide of war turned not just on the map, but in the mind. The Germans had gambled everything on surprise, and for a time, that gamble worked. The initial shock of the Ardennes offensive paralyzed Allied command, cut communications, and nearly split the front in two. But surprise, as every strategist knows, is a wasting asset. Once lost, it cannot be regained." When the skies cleared and the Allies found their footing, the outcome was inevitable. Hitler had bought himself only a few weeks paid for in the blood of his last soldiers. As February turned to March, the remnants of the German armies limped back behind the Siegfried Line. The Ardennes was over. The Allied counteroffensive surged forward, crossing the Rhine at Remagen in early March, a feat that stunned even Eisenhower. From then on, the war in the West became a pursuit. Yet among soldiers, the memory of the Ardennes lingered like frostbite that never healed. In American history, the Battle of the Bulge became a symbol of endurance, the moment when ordinary soldiers, unprepared and outnumbered, held their ground against one of the fiercest offensives of the modern age. Men from small towns and farms, barely trained, faced SS Panzer veterans and survived. It was chaos turned to courage, fear turned to resolve. "I don't think we understood what we were part of," said one survivor decades later. "We were just trying not to die." But their defense at places like Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge changed the course of the war. For the Germans, it was the twilight of the Wehrmacht. The divisions that limped home from the Ardennes would be thrown into battle again against the Russians, only to be annihilated. Many officers, like Manteuffel, later confessed that they had known from the start the plan could not succeed. "We could achieve surprise," he said, "but not victory." Yet no one dared to tell Hitler that. In that silence lay the tragedy of Germany's final months, a leader who no longer listened, and generals, too, frightened to speak. By the spring of 1945, the snow was gone, and with it the last illusion that the Reich could endure. The roads through the Ardennes were rebuilt, the dead buried, and the tanks hauled away to scrapyards. But beneath the surface, the soil remained soaked with oil and blood. Local farmers would still find shell fragments decades later, and children playing in the woods would stumble upon rusted helmets or the bones of soldiers who never made it home. The battle had ended, but the land remembered. In April, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and the Red Army entered Berlin, Eisenhower visited the front lines one last time. Standing among the ruins of a Belgian village, He looked across the snow-melted fields where so many had fought and died. This, he said quietly to his aide, was the test. We nearly failed it. But we learned. His words were not triumphal. They were reflective, even haunted. Victory in Europe was now certain, but it had been purchased with arrogance and redeemed by sacrifice. In the years that followed, historians would write volumes on the Ardennes, on the intelligence failure, the heroism, the madness of Hitler's decision. They would study the signals, the memos, the missed warnings, and the human stories buried within them. But those who were there needed no books to remember. They carried the Ardennes in their scars, in their silence, and in the nightmares that returned with every winter snow. When the final tally was made, the Battle of the Bulge had cost the Germans over 100,000 casualties, and the Americans $89,000, the highest single battle toll for the U.S. in Europe. But numbers could not measure what had been lost and learned. The Ardennes was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror. It showed the Allies their vulnerability, and the Germans their doom. It proved that even at the edge of defeat, war still had lessons to teach, lessons written in frost and blood. The forest that had hidden Hitler's armies in December now stood quiet again. Only the wind moved among the trees, whispering through the branches, and if one listened closely, it seemed to carry the echoes of engines, gunfire, and men calling out in the snow, reminders of a winter when the world nearly turned once more toward darkness.